Chapter 21 of Esthajnalcsillag, Morningstar. The military plane shuddered as it descended, the hum of the engines vibrating through the thin metal walls. 11-year-old Morningstar pressed her forehead against the small, icy windows, searching for the world that awaited her beyond the darkness. The runaway lights stretched like glowing ribbons across the frozen ground, and as the wheels touched down with a jolt, her breath caught in her throat. She gripped her mother's hand. The warmth of it was familiar, but everything else was unknown. Soldiers moved through the cabin, their boots heavy against the floor, their voices brisk but not unkind. She understood only a few words. Stay seated, wait. But the tone was clear. They had arrived. The door groaned open and the December air rushed in, sharp and foreign. Stepping onto the metal stairs, she squinted against the floodlights, the cold biting through her thin coat. Somewhere in the distance, beyond the fences and the barracks, beyond the uniformed men, was the city she had only seen in pictures. New York, America. Her father had onto their few belongings. Her mother carried her younger sibling, and together they followed the line of refugees toward an uncertain future. The ground beneath her feet was solid, yet she felt as though she were floating, untethered between the past and whatever came next. Would she ever see her home again? Would she learn the language, make friends, belong? She swallowed the lump in her throat and took another step. The cold air burned her lungs. As she stepped off the last metal stair and onto the tarmac, the night was vast, swallowing the figures of soldiers and families moving in clusters, their breath visible in the freezing air. She clutched her coat tightly around her, wishing it was thicker. She wasn't sure if she was shivering from the cold or from the weight of everything unknown. Her father turned to her, his eyes searching her face. "You'll what, Gishlan?" he asked gently. She nodded, though she wasn't sure if he meant it. The army base loomed ahead, low buildings with small glowing windows casting long shadows. She could smell fuel and something metallic in the air. Inside, the warmth was overwhelming after the bitter cold. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a strange, pale glow. Soldiers guided them toward a large hall where rows of cots lined the walls. Other families were already settling in, their whispers mixing with the occasional cry of a baby. A woman in uniform handed them thick woolen blankets. She watched as her mother settled her younger sibling onto one of the cots. Smoothing their hair, her father sat beside them, rubbing his hands together for warmth. They looked exhausted. For the first time since they left, her mother allowed herself to exhale deeply, pressing her fingers against her temples. The girl sat on the edge of the cot, wrapping the rough blanket around her shoulders. Her legs dangled, not quite reaching the floor. She felt small in this vast, foreign place. Her stomach ached, not from hunger, but something else, a hollowness. A soldier approached, kneeling in front of them. His uniform was stiff, his face lined but kind. He spoke slowly, his words careful, but she could only catch fragments. Safe now, food soon, sleep. Her father nodded, replying in broken English. The soldier gave a small smile, then reached into his pocket. When he held out his hand, something red and shiny rested in his palm, a piece of candy. She hesitated before taking it, her fingers brushing against the smooth wrapper. It was small, but in that moment it felt like a gift from another world. Another world was probably where the soldier came from, because his skin was dark as chocolate, Morningstar thought to herself. Our little girl had seen Tarzan movies in Hungary, and that land had a chocolate people in it, she thought. Maybe they are in Africa, and this is the chocolate man's home. No, she heard her father say that the family is in the USA. She unwrapped it, placed it on her tongue, and let the sweetness of the candy melt slowly. It was the first taste of America. The sweetness of the candy lingered on her tongue, a strange contrast to the heavy, unfamiliar air of the army base. Around her, families whispered to one another in Hungarian, Polish, German, languages of the displaced. Some voices carried relief, other exhaustion. A few held the quiet tremor of uncertainty. She curled up under the rough woolen blanket, but sleep did not come easily. The sound of the boots on the hard floor, distant murmurs, and the occasional cry of a baby filled the room. Her mother lay beside her, eyes open, staring at the ceiling. Her father had his arms crossed, his expression unreasonable. The parents of Morningstar had a bitter fight, her mother screaming at the father that he promised they would not go to America. And now here they were. She did not hear the end of the fight. Morningstar dozed off again. The girl turned onto her side, watching the way the dim overhead lights cast long shadows. This was America, but it didn't feel like the land of dreams yet. It felt cold, bright, too big. She squeezed her eyes shut, willing herself to sleep. Sometimes later, minutes or hours, she couldn't tell, she was nudged awake. A soldier had returned, motioning for them to follow. She wiped her sleepy eyes and held onto her mother's hand as they were led down a corridor past other refugees still resting. A new room awaited, this one with long tables, and the scent of something warm smelled like food. She hadn't realized how hungry she was until she saw the trays being handed out. A steaming bowl of something thick, stew, soup, perhaps, a hunk of bread, a thin cup filled with water. It wasn't much, but it was warm. It was food. She sat between her parents, dipping the bread into the soup, tasting salt, meat, and something unfamiliar. It was different from home. No paprika, no familiar spices, but she ate every bite, the warmth spreading through her chest. As she glanced around the room, she saw other children, their eyes just as wide, their moves just as hesitant. A little girl across from her clutched a doll in one arm, using the other to scoop up her food. Another boy, not much older than her, stared down at his soup, stirring it absent-mindedly. Were they as scared as she was? Did they miss their old lives too? Morningstar thought to herself. Her father spoke to a man at the next table, his Hungarian mixing with broken English. She listened carefully, trying to catch words she understood. Where next? Her father asked. The man shrugged. Not sure. Camp, maybe, or a city. Papers first. Papers. She knew that word. Papers meant permissions. Papers meant staying or going, belonging or waiting. The girl swallowed the last of her soup as she set her spoon down carefully. The weight of uncertainty pressed on her small shoulders. They had made it to America, but where would they go next? As she set down her spoon, feeling the warmth of the food settle inside her, movement caught her eye near the doorway. A soldier stood there, speaking quietly with another officer. But he was different from the other she had seen. His skin was dark, the color of polished wood, his uniform crisp like the others, but his face unfamiliar in a way she had never known before. She blinked, curiosity flickering in her tired mind. In Hungary, she had never seen a man who looked like him. The only soldiers she had known were Soviet uniforms, their presence heavy with fear. But this man, this American soldier, stood tall, his posture firm, yet not threatening. As if sensing her gaze, he turned slightly, and for a brief moment their eyes met. Instead of the cold, distant stares she had grown used to from soldiers back home, his eyes were warm and kind. She quickly looked down at her empty tray, unsure if she had stared too long. But before she could turn away completely, she heard a deep voice, his voice. Hello there, he said, his words slow, careful. She hesitated, then glanced up again. He was smiling. She didn't know the words to answer, but instinctively she nodded, her fingers gripping the edge of the wooden bench. He reached into his pocket, just like the other soldier had, and pulled out something small. He stepped forward and held out his hand. A piece of candy wrapped in bright red paper. Her breath caught. Another gift, another piece of America. She looked up at her mother, uncertain. Her mother, who had been watching this exchange, gave a small nod. Tentatively, the girl reached out and took the candy. The soldier's smile widened. Then, with a nod, he stepped back and returned to his conversation with the other officer. She unwrapped the candy slowly, letting the sweet scent fill her nose before placing it on her tongue. It was different from the first one, fruitier, tangy. She let it melt, savoring it, her mind spinning with thoughts. America was different. The people looked different. The food tasted different. The air smelled different. But maybe, just maybe, different wasn't bad. After eating, the family had their first ride into the city of New York. It was dark and cold, but the excitement of seeing the big city gave way to pure joy. The bus rattled as it pulled away from the army base, its windows fogged from the breath of the refugees packed inside. Morningstar sat pressed between her mother and younger sibling, her small hands clutching the edge of her seat. The warmth of the base faded as they rolled into the unknown. She wiped the glass with her sleeve, her heart quickening. Outside, the world passed in a blur of gray and white. Wide roads, cars that looked bigger than the ones back home, and the buildings taller than anything she had ever seen. Then they crossed a bridge. The city rose before her. New York, her breath caught in her throat. The skyline stretched endlessly, lights twinkling against the early evening sky. Buildings taller than she ever imagined glowed with golden windows. The streets below were alive, filled with moving cars and people bundled in thick coats. The air seemed to shimmer with something electric, something alive. And then, oh, the decorations! She had never seen anything like it. Wreaths hung from street lamps, golden balls and red ribbons tied in perfect bows. Storefronts glowed with twinkling lights, and in one window, a miniature train chugged through a tiny snow-covered village. Everywhere, Christmas trees stood tall, draped in silver tinsel and sparkling ornaments. Morningstar pressed her hand on the glass, her breath fogging the window again. She barely noticed the cold. In Hungary, Christmas had been simple. Paper garlands, candlelight, a small tree if they were lucky. But this was like stepping into a dream. The bus turned onto a wide avenue, and suddenly there it was, larger than anything she could have imagined. A Christmas tree so big it seemed to touch the sky. She gasped. The Rockefeller Center tree, though she didn't know its name yet, stood in the middle of the city like a beacon of light. Thousands of tiny bulbs shimmering against its branches, reflecting off the ice skating rink below, where people glided in graceful circles. Laughter and music filled the air. Look, Mama, she whispered, tugging at her mother's sleeve. Her mother, weary but smiling, followed her gaze. For the first time in days, Morningstar saw a flicker of something familiar in her mother's eyes. Wonder, hope. Her father, sitting across from them, gave a small nod. Beautiful, he murmured in Hungarian. The bus continued through the city, past department store windows displaying moving figurines, toy soldiers marching in perfect rhythm, a family of bears decorating a tree, a dollhouse aglow with tiny candles, Snowflakes, real and artificial, swirled in the air, catching the glow of the streetlights. America was cold. It was loud. It was nothing like home. But as Morningstar stared out at the glittering city, she felt something stir inside her. Maybe, just maybe, this place had magic too. End of chapter 21. End of book 1 of Esthajnalcsillag Morningstar.